Man lived alone in the UP for 7 years after his wife died. Liked it that way. Then one winter, something started leaving tracks. Big ones. Comment 3 if you want to know what he did about it. Okay, here we go. The cold in the Upper Peninsula had teeth that winter. Not the kind that nipped at your nose and made you pull your collar up, the kind that bit down to bone and held on like it planned to stay. Bob Macklin had lived through 67 winters, 40 of them up here in Marquette County, and he knew the difference between cold that passed through and cold that settled in for good. This was settling in cold. The cabin sat back in the pines where the old logging road gave up trying to be a road and just became 2 ruts in the earth. 20 miles from town, 5 from the nearest neighbor who only showed up summers anyway. The Forest Service had built it in the 70s as a ranger station, back when Bob was young enough to hike the whole district in a day and stupid enough to think that mattered. Now it was just his. The service didn't need remote stations anymore, had drones and satellites, and kids fresh out of college who could tell you what tree was sick from a computer screen 2 states away, but couldn't read a deer trail if their life depended on it. Bob could read trails, could read weather, animal sign, the particular way snow sat on branches that told you which way the wind would turn, could read the forest the way some men read the newspaper, every morning, looking for what changed overnight. It was the only language he still trusted. The morning it started, he was splitting wood behind the cabin. Steam rose off his shoulders despite the cold. The maul came down clean, birch splitting with that satisfying crack that meant the grain was straight and the wood was dry. His breath clouded the air in front of him, disappeared, came again. The rhythm was good: lift, swing, split, stack. Lift, swing, split, stack. No thought required, just motion, just the work, keeping his hands busy and his mind somewhere else. Somewhere else was where it lived most days now. In the kitchen where Ellen used to hum while making coffee. In the bedroom where her side of the bed stayed, made because he couldn't bring himself to mess it up. In the silence that had weight now, that pressed against the walls and made every room too big and too small at the same time. 4 years she'd been gone. Pancreatic cancer. 3 months from diagnosis to dirt. And in those 3 months, she'd tried to make him promise things. Promise he'd call their daughter. Promise he'd move somewhere with people. Promise he wouldn't disappear into the woods like some ghost who forgot he was already dead. He hadn't promised. Couldn't lie to her. Not at the end. The maul hit a knot and stuck. He worked it free, tossed the piece aside for kindling, grabbed another. The dog Riley, 12 years old, with a grey muzzle and hips that clicked when he walked, lay on the porch watching. Not interested in the work. Just keeping Bob in sight the way old dogs do when they know their person is the only thing standing between them and being alone. Bob understood that. He was reaching for another log when Riley's head came up. Ears forward, not back. That was the first sign. The second was the stillness. Every bird had gone quiet. Not unusual hawks did that. Owls sometimes, but this felt different. Felt like the forest was holding its breath. What is it, boy? Riley didn't answer, just stared past the woodpile toward the tree line where the pines grew so thick the snow barely made it through. Bob followed his gaze, saw nothing. The wind moved through the high branches, that whisper hiss sound that never quite stopped up here. A clump of snow fell from a hemlock and hit the ground with a soft thump. Nothing else moved. He went back to splitting, but the rhythm was gone. 3 more pieces, and he gave up. Stacked what he'd done, and went inside. Riley followed, tail low, still looking back over his shoulder. Inside, the cabin smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the faint musty smell of a place that only one person lived in. Bob poured himself a cup from the pot he'd made that morning, thick, black, strong enough to strip paint, stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the clearing. The light was that particular grey that winter afternoons got up here. Not quite dusk, but heading that direction. Shadows stretched long from the pines. The woodpile cast its own shadow, a dark line across unmarked snow, except the snow wasn't unmarked. Bob set the cup down, moved closer to the window. squinted through the old glass that distorted things slightly, made straight lines waver. The track was maybe 30 feet from the porch. Single print, deep, broader than his boot by half again. 5 toes, clearly defined, weight distribution wrong for a bear. Bears walk different, had a rolling gait that showed in how their prints Saturday. This was upright. Bipedal, his chest tightened. Not fear exactly, something older than that. Recognition maybe, or the absence of surprise. Like some part of him had been waiting for this without knowing it was waiting. He pulled on his Carhartt jacket, the one with the torn pocket and the stains that wouldn't wash out, grabbed his rifle from beside the door, Winchester, 30-30, same one he'd carried for 40 years. Didn't chamber around, didn't think he'd need to, just having it felt right. Riley whined, but didn't follow when Bob stepped outside. The cold hit him like a fist, took his breath for a second, made his eyes water. He blinked it away and walked slow across the clearing, boots crunching through the crust of old snow, each step deliberate, placing his feet careful like the ground might give way if he rushed. The track was bigger up close, 16 inches, maybe 17. Pressed deep enough that the edges were clean. Whatever made it had weight, real weight. The snow around it was undisturbed. No brush marks, no drag marks, nothing to suggest how it got there or where it went after. Just the one print, placed deliberate as a signature. Bob crouched down, knees protesting, touched the edge of the print with one gloved finger. The snow was hard, compressed. This wasn't fresh, maybe 6-8 hours old, made this morning while he was inside, drinking coffee and trying not to think about what day it was. Thursday. Would have been their anniversary. 43 years if she'd lived. He stood up slow, looked toward the tree line. The forest looked back, giving nothing away. Somewhere deep in the pines, a raven called once, harsh and final. Then silence again. Bob walked the perimeter of the clearing, found 2 more tracks, both partials, both heading north toward the river bluffs where the land dropped away steep and the ice built up in layers thick as concrete. No pattern to them, no trail, just 3 prints placed random as thoughts. Or maybe not random. Maybe placed exactly where they needed to be seen. He went back inside as the light failed, fed Riley, heated up leftover stew that tasted like cardboard, but filled the space in his stomach. Sat by the window with the rifle across his lap and watched the dark come in from the trees like water rising. Nothing moved out there, but that meant nothing. The UP had secrets older than the roads, older than the towns, older than the treaties that said this land belonged to anyone. Bob had spent 40 years walking these woods, had seen things he couldn't explain, and learned not to try. Deer that watched him with too much intelligence, sounds that didn't match any animal he knew, places where the compass spun lazy circles and the air felt thick as honey. The forest kept its own counsel, always had. He dozed in the chair, rifle sliding to the floor, jerking awake when Riley growled low in his throat. The clock on the wall said 2:17 a.m. The fire had burned down to embers, just enough light to see shapes but not details. Riley stood at the door, hackles up, staring. Bob picked up the rifle, stood slow, joints cracking loud in the quiet, moved to the window and looked out. The moon had risen, 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows. The clearing was empty. The woodpile sat undisturbed. The trees stood black against grey snow. Then he saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, where the pines grew thick, something moved, not walked, moved. A shift in the darkness, a shape that separated itself from the tree line for just a second, tall, broader than any man. There and gone so fast, Bob couldn't be sure he'd seen anything at all. Riley growled again, deeper this time. Easy, boy. Bob's hand found the door handle. Some part of his brain, the part that used to make good decisions, told him this was stupid, told him to stay inside, lock the door, wait for morning. But that part had been getting quieter the last 4 years, drowned out by the part that didn't much care what happened anymore. He opened the door, The cold rushed in like it had been waiting for permission. Bob stepped onto the porch, rifle raised but not aimed, finger off the trigger. His breath came out in clouds that hung in front of his face. The boards under his boots creaked loud as gunshots. "I know you're there." His voice sounded small against the silence, swallowed up by the trees and the snow and the weight of night pressing down. Nothing answered. He waited, counted his heartbeats, got to 30 before he spoke again. "This is my place. Been my place 40 years. Don't want trouble, don't plan to cause any. But I need to know what you want." The silence changed. Didn't break, just changed. The way air changes right before a storm. A presence, heavy as gravity, pushing against the edges of the clearing. Then, from the tree line, a sound. Low, guttural, rolling. Not a growl, not a roar. Something between the two. Something that started in a chest too big for human and resonated through the ground itself. Bob felt it in his boots, in his bones, in the part of his brain that still remembered when humans weren't the thing you had to fear in the dark. The shape moved again, stepped forward just enough that moonlight caught it. Shoulders first, broad as a doorway. Then the head, massive, fur catching silver light. Arms that hung too long. A posture that said upright was natural, not something learned. It didn't come closer, just stood there, maybe 40 feet away, letting itself be seen. Bob's hands tightened on the rifle, not from fear, from something else. Something that felt like recognition without knowing what he was recognizing. They looked at each other. Bob saw eyes that caught moonlight wrong, reflecting like an animal's but set in a face that wasn't animal. Saw breath steaming from nostrils. Saw the rise and fall of that massive chest. Saw intelligence in the way it held itself. Not threatening, not submissive, just present, waiting. For what? Bob didn't know. "I see you," he said finally. Not a challenge, just a statement of fact. The creature, because that's what it was, no point pretending otherwise, tilted its head slightly. A human gesture, or close enough. Then it took one step backward, another, disappeared into the trees without a sound, like smoke pulled into a draft. The presence lifted. The air went back to normal. Riley stopped growling, started whining instead, confused. Bob stood on the porch until his feet went numb and his hands couldn't feel the rifle anymore. Then he went inside, locked the door, built up the fire, and sat in his chair watching the window until the sun came up gray and grudging over the pines. He didn't sleep, didn't try to, just sat there with the rifle across his lap and Riley at his feet, both of them listening to the cabin settle and creak and the wind move through trees that had seen things like this before and would see them again long after Bob was dust. When morning finally came, he made coffee, stood at the window and looked out at the clearing. The tracks from yesterday were still there, no new ones, but something had changed. He felt it, the way you feel weather coming, a shift in pressure, in the quality of light, in the way the forest held itself. Something had started. He just didn't know what yet. The days that followed had a strange quality to them. Not different exactly, just revealed. Like Bob had been looking at the world through dirty glass his whole life, and someone had finally wiped a corner clean. The trees looked the same. The snow fell the same. The cold bit the same. But underneath all that sameness, something waited. He went about his routine because that's what you did when you were 67, and alive only because routine kept your heart beating. Coffee at dawn, thick and black. Feed Riley. Check the wood stove. Add a log. Stir the coals until they bloomed orange against the dark. The same mug Ellen used to drink from blue ceramic with a chip on the rim where she dropped it once, glued it back together with epoxy that had yellowed over time. He hadn't used it in 4 years. Hadn't thrown it out either. Some things you kept, not because they were useful, but because letting go felt like betraying the dead. He checked the clearing each morning from the window before going out, looking for tracks, for signs, for proof he hadn't imagined what he'd seen. The snow told stories if you knew how to read them. Mouse trails like tiny highways. Deer tracks heading to the river. Once, The drag marks where an owl had taken a rabbit, wings leaving imprints like angels in the snow. No more of the large prints. Not for 3 days. But Bob felt watched. Not threatened, watched. The way you feel eyes on you in a crowded room, that prickle at the base of your skull that says someone's attention is pointed your way. He'd felt it before, years ago, walking the back country alone, had learned to trust it. The forest had rhythms, and when those rhythms changed, you paid attention or you didn't come back. On the 4th day, he found the gift. He'd gone out to check the snare line he ran along the ridge. Not that he needed rabbit. The freezer had enough venison to last him through spring, but the routine mattered. Keep moving, keep checking, keep your hands busy. Otherwise, the silence got too loud, and the house got too empty, and 4 years stopped feeling like enough time to learn how to be alone. The snares were empty, except for one that had a pine marten, already frozen stiff. He reset it, hung the marten from his belt, moved on. The snow had that particular crunch it got when the temperature dropped below 0, each step breaking through the crust with a sound like bones snapping. His breath came out white and hung in the air behind him. Riley followed at a distance, nose down, moving slow on those bad hips. The wood was stacked at the edge of the clearing when they got back. Bob stopped, stared, felt his chest tighten. Someone had split his wood. The pile he'd left scattered behind the cabin the pieces he'd been meaning to get to. The ones with knots and twists that made them all stick, they were split clean and stacked neat against the cabin wall. A cord, at least, maybe more. Stacked the way his father had taught him, bark side up, so the rain would run off, rows tight and level. Riley sniffed the pile, tail uncertain. Bob moved closer, slow, like approaching a spooked deer. The splits were clean. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, knew how to read the grain, where to strike. No axe marks on the cabin wall, no scattered bark or wood chips, just the work done, and done right. He looked toward the tree line, saw nothing. But the feeling of being watched intensified, became almost physical, like hands pressing gentle against his shoulders. "Thank you," he said to the air. The wind moved through the pines. Nothing answered. Inside, he hung the marten to thaw, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. The wood stacking bothered him. Not the fact of it, the why of it. Gifts came with obligations, debts. His father had taught him that too, back when teaching meant back hands and belt buckles, and lessons that stuck because they hurt. You don't take without giving. You don't accept help without owing. But what did you owe something that shouldn't exist? What did you give to something the world said wasn't real? The thought circled his mind like a dog looking for a place to lay down. He tried to remember what Ellen would have said. She'd been the one who believed in things that couldn't be explained. Astrology, intuition, the idea that some debts were paid in kindness rather than currency. He'd always thought it was bullshit, the kind of thinking that came from reading too many books and not enough time in the real world. Now he wasn't sure. He spent the afternoon in the cabin, restless. Tried to read a Louis L'Amour paperback he'd read 3 times already. The words wouldn't stick. Tried watching the small TV that got 2 channels when the weather was right. Just static and snow. Ended up at the window again, coffee going cold in his hands, watching the light fail over the clearing. Dusk came early this time of year. The sun gave up around 4:30, and the dark rushed in like it had somewhere to be. Bob lit the kerosene lamp, fed the stove, heated up beans, and ate them standing at the counter. Riley got half, the way he always did. The dog ate slow, careful, like his teeth hurt. Probably did. Bob's hurt too. Getting old was just one long process of things breaking down and learning to live with the breaking. He was washing the bowl when he heard it. 3 knocks, deliberate, spaced, not on the door on the cabin wall, around back where the firewood was stacked. Riley's ears went up. Bob set the bowl down slow, reached for the rifle, then stopped. Whatever was out there had stacked his wood, had been watching for days and done nothing but watch. A rifle felt wrong. felt like answering kindness with suspicion. He opened the door instead. The cold hit him like always, but he barely felt it. Stepped onto the porch, moved to the edge where he could see around the side of the cabin. The lamplight from the window cast a weak yellow glow across the snow. The creature stood beside the woodpile. Closer this time, maybe 20 feet. Close enough that Bob could see details he'd missed in the moonlight. The fur was dark, almost black, but shot through with gray around the face and shoulders, like Bob's own hair had gone. The eyes caught the lamplight and held it, reflected it back amber gold. The hands, because they were hands, not paws, hung at its sides, fingers long and thick, capable. It didn't move, just stood there, breath steaming in the cold, watching him with an expression Bob couldn't read, but felt like he should recognize. "You did the wood," Bob said. Not a question. The creature's head tilted slightly. That same, almost human gesture from before. Bob's heart hammered against his ribs. Not from fear, from something bigger than fear, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down and understanding just how small you were, how vast the world was, how much you didn't know. "I don't have much to give back," he said, "but I've got food. Coffee. You want some?" The creature didn't move for a long moment. Then it took one step backward, not retreating exactly, more like giving space, creating distance that felt comfortable rather than necessary. Bob understood. He went inside, left the door open behind him. Riley whined but stayed put. Bob moved to the kitchen, hands shaking slightly as he pulled down another mug. His mug, the plain white one he used every day. Poured coffee from the pot, strong enough to strip paint. Added nothing. Something told him sugar and cream would be wrong here. He carried the mug outside. The creature hadn't moved except to turn its body slightly toward him. Bob set the mug on the porch railing, stepped back. The wood beneath his boots creaked. His breath came out in clouds that disappeared into the dark. "It's there if you want it," he said. Then he went inside, closed the door, stood at the window and watched. The creature waited. 1 minute, 2. Then it moved forward, slow and careful. Picked up the mug with both hands. The mug looked small in those hands, delicate. It brought the mug to its face, not drinking, just smelling. Then it drank. One long pull set the mug back down on the railing exactly where Bob had placed it. It looked toward the window. Bob knew it could see him standing there. Knew he was watching. The creature raised one hand, not a wave, something else. Palm out, fingers spread. A gesture that felt old, older than language, older than any book that tried to explain what things meant. Then it turned and walked into the trees. Not fast, not hiding, just walking, the way you walked when you knew you'd be back. Bob stood at the window until he couldn't feel his feet anymore. The mug sat on the railing, steam rising from it into the cold. Empty. The next morning, Bob found deer meat hanging from the porch beam. A hindquarter, field dressed, clean, frozen solid in the cold. No blood on the porch, no mess. Just the meat, hung professional as anything Bob had done himself in 40 years of hunting. He stood looking at it, coffee in hand, trying to figure out what he'd stepped into. This wasn't animals acting strange. This wasn't seeing things that might be explained away. This was trade, exchange, relationship. The word felt strange even thinking it. He took the meat down, carried it inside, hung it in the cold room where he kept his stores. Good meat, better than good. Whatever had killed this deer knew what it was doing. That afternoon, Bob made soup, venison, onions, carrots from the root cellar, potatoes, salt and pepper. Let it simmer on the wood stove for hours until the cabin smelled like something living happened inside it, instead of just a man waiting to die. At dusk, he ladled out a bowl, carried it outside, set it on the porch railing next to where the coffee mug had been. "Seems fair," he said to the trees. He went inside, watched from the window. The sun went down. The stars came out, hard and bright and cold. Around 8 o'clock, a shape detached from the darkness, moved to the porch, picked up the bowl. This time, the creature didn't leave right away. It sat on the porch steps, sat like a person would sit, and ate the soup slow. Bob could see the steam rising from the bowl, could see the careful way it ate, like someone who'd learned manners somewhere, sometime, in ways Bob couldn't begin to guess. When it finished, it set the bowl down, stood, looked toward the window. Bob stepped outside. They stood there, 10 feet apart, the length of the porch between them. The creature's eyes caught the lamp light from inside. Bob's hands hung at his sides, empty. He felt old suddenly, old and small, and very aware of how alone he'd been, how alone he'd wanted to be, and how maybe that was changing whether he wanted it to or not. "I don't know what this is," Bob said. His voice came out rough. "Don't know what you want. Don't know what I'm supposed to do. But I know you helped me, and where I come from, you helped back." The creature made a sound, low, not threatening, almost like a rumble of agreement. Then it did something that made Bob's chest tighten. It placed one hand over its chest, over where a heart would be. Bob lifted his hand slow, placed it over his own heart, felt it beating there, stubborn and insistent, keeping time. They stood like that for a moment. Then the creature nodded, definitely a nod this time, no mistaking it, and walked down the steps, across the clearing, into the trees. Bob stayed on the porch until the cold drove him inside, picked up the bowl. It was scraped clean, not a drop left. The pattern continued. Bob would leave food. The creature would leave wood, or meat, or once a bundle of pine boughs that burned sweet in the stove and made the cabin smell like Christmas. They didn't speak, couldn't speak, Bob figured, though he wasn't sure anymore what was possible and what wasn't. But they understood each other, somehow. A week passed. Then, 2. The exchanges became routine. Normal. Bob found himself looking forward to dusk, to the moment when the shape would appear at the tree line. Found himself talking sometimes, just talking, about nothing important. The weather, the deer he'd seen, how Riley's hips were getting worse, and he didn't know what he'd do when the dog finally gave out. The creature listened. Bob could tell it listened because of how it held itself, the attention in its posture. Sometimes it would make sounds in response, low rumbles, or something that might have been words in a language Bob's ears weren't built to hear. On the 15th night, Bob asked the question that had been building. Why me? The creature sat on the porch steps. Bob sat in his chair by the door. Rifle leaned against the wall inside, but not needed. Hadn't been needed. Riley slept at Bob's feet, snoring soft. "I'm nobody," Bob continued. "Retired ranger living on a pension. Got a daughter I haven't talked to in 3 years. Got a dead wife I still set a place for sometimes. I'm just a man running out the clock. So why?" The creature turned its head, looked at him with those eyes that reflected lamplight back like coins at the bottom of a well. It stood, moved closer. Bob's breath caught, but he didn't move, didn't reach for the rifle, just sat there as the creature approached until it was standing right in front of him, close enough that Bob could smell it, earth and pine, and something else, something wild that had no name. The creature reached out one hand. Slow, careful, placed it on Bob's shoulder. The weight of it was immense, not pressing, just present, solid, real. They stayed like that. Then the creature removed its hand and stepped back. Made a sound Bob had never heard before, something between a sigh and a song, something that sounded almost like grief. Bob understood. You lost someone too. The creature's shoulders dropped, its head lowered, and Bob saw it then, the same weight he carried, reflected back in a body that wasn't human but felt human in all the ways that mattered. "I'm sorry," Bob said. Meant it. The creature looked up, nodded once. Then it reached into the fur at its chest and pulled something out. Extended its hand toward Bob. In its palm lay a stone. River rock, smooth and dark, with a vein of quartz running through it like a frozen lightning bolt. Bob took it. The stone was warm despite the cold. Felt good in his hand. Substantial. "Thank you," he said. The creature touched its chest again. Then Bob's. Then it turned, and walked into the darkness. Bob sat on the porch long after it was gone, the stone in his hand, Riley's warmth against his feet, and something in his chest that felt dangerously close to hope. He went inside, set the stone on the windowsill where morning light would find it. That night, for the first time in 4 years, Bob slept through until dawn without waking once. When he opened his eyes, sunlight was streaming through the window, hitting the stone and breaking into colors he didn't know had names. Riley was still asleep, breathing steady. The cabin was warm. The fire had burned through the night without going out. Bob got up slow, made coffee, stood at the window, looking out at the clearing. 3 figures stood at the tree line. His heart stopped, started again. The creature from before, the one he'd been trading with, stood in the center. To its left, something smaller. To its right, something larger still. Family, Bob thought. It brought its family. The smaller one, a juvenile maybe, hard to tell, moved forward slightly. Curious. The larger one put a hand on its shoulder, holding it back. Protective. Bob's daughter had been like that once. Curious, rushing toward everything, and Ellen pulling her back, saying careful. Careful in that voice that was half warning, half laughter. He opened the door, stepped onto the porch. The cold bit, but he barely felt it. Morning, he said. The 3 figures stood silent, watching. The juvenile shifted from foot to foot. The larger one, a female maybe, he didn't know, stood solid as a tree. His creature, because that's what it had become in his mind. His creature. His friend raised its hand. The gesture from before. Palm out. Fingers spread. Bob raised his hand in return. Then the larger one made a sound. Sharp. Urgent. The creature's head snapped toward the trees behind them. The juvenile moved closer to its parents, because that's what they were. Bob could see it now. A family. Something was wrong. The creature looked back at Bob. Its eyes held something Bob recognized from his ranger days. The look deer got right before they bolted. The look rabbits had in the snare. Fear. Something was coming. And whatever it was coming fast. The forest exploded with sound. Not one sound, a cascade of them. Branches snapping like rifle shots. Something heavy moving through the undergrowth. Not careful, not quiet. The opposite of how his creature moved. This was force. This was rage looking for something to break against. The 3 figures at the tree line scattered. The female grabbed the juvenile, pulled it back toward deeper cover. Bob's creature held its ground for a moment, looking between Bob and the approaching sound, calculation moving behind those amber eyes. Then it turned and followed its family into the trees. Bob stood on the porch, Riley at his feet now, hackles up, growling low and continuous. The dog knew danger when it smelled it. So did Bob. 40 years in these woods had taught him the difference between animals passing through and animals hunting. This was hunting. The sound stopped. Silence rushed back in, but it was the wrong kind of silence. Not peace anticipation. The moment before the predator strikes, Bob's hand found the door frame, gripped it. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to get out, like it knew something his brain hadn't caught up to yet. Then he saw it. The thing that came out of the trees was bigger than his creature, taller by a foot at least, broader through the shoulders by half. Its fur was lighter, almost gray, matted, and unkempt where his creature's had been sleek. It moved wrong, not the careful, deliberate way his creature moved, but with a rolling gait that spoke of old injuries poorly healed and pain that had turned into anger somewhere along the line. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, raised its head, scented the air. Bob didn't move, barely breathed. Riley's growl intensified. The creature's eyes found him. They weren't like his creature's eyes. These were small, set deep, burning with something that looked like hunger but felt like hate. It took one step into the clearing, another, not rushing, taking its time, like it knew Bob wasn't going anywhere. Bob's mind raced. The rifle was inside, leaning against the wall, maybe 6 feet away. He could reach it in 3 seconds. Chamber around in 2 more. But 5 seconds might be 4 too many, and shooting felt wrong anyway. felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. The creature took another step, opened its mouth. The sound that came out made Riley yelp and back up against Bob's legs. It wasn't a roar. It was worse than a roar. It was rage given voice, the sound of something that had been hurt too many times and decided to hurt back. Bob understood that sound, had made it himself once, in the hospital cafeteria when they told him Ellen was gone, when the coffee in his hand had seemed like the most absurd thing in the universe, and he'd thrown it against the wall and screamed until security came. "Easy," Bob said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Easy now." The creature's head tilted, focused on him with an intensity that felt physical. It took another step. Now it was fully in the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, close enough that Bob could see scars crisscrossing its torso. Old wounds, badly healed. Marks that spoke of violence, survived but not forgotten. Something hit the creature from behind. His creature, smaller, faster, had come from the trees at a run and slammed into the larger one's back. They went down together, a tangle of limbs and fur and fury. The sound was tremendous. Grunts and roars, and the impact of bodies hitting frozen ground. Bob moved without thinking. Grabbed the rifle, chambered a round, stepped off the porch. Riley barked behind him, sharp and panicked, but Bob kept moving. The two creatures rolled across the clearing. His creature was outmatched, smaller, lighter, fighting from underneath. The larger one's hands found his creature's throat, pressed down. His creature's legs kicked, found the larger one's chest, pushed. They separated. Both scrambled to their feet, circled each other, breath steaming in the cold. Bob raised the rifle, not aiming at either one, just ready. The larger creature saw him, saw the rifle, made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could be soaked in contempt. It knew what guns were, knew what they could do, didn't care. It charged, not at his creature, at Bob. Everything slowed down. Bob's finger found the trigger. 40 years of muscle memory took over. Breathe, sight, squeeze. But his creature got there first. It hit the larger one from the side, deflecting the charge, sending both of them sprawling toward the tree line instead of the porch. They crashed into a pine sapling, snapped it like kindling, kept going, into the forest. The sound of their fighting, receded branches breaking, bodies hitting trees, those terrible sounds of rage and pain, then silence. Bob stood in the clearing, rifle still raised, heart trying to break through his sternum. Riley was barking continuously now, sharp, frightened barks that said he didn't understand what was happening and needed Bob to make it stop. "Quiet, boy, quiet." Riley quieted to whimpers. Bob waited. 1 minute. 2. The forest gave him nothing, just wind and the creak of branches, and his own breathing too loud in his ears. Then a sound, footsteps, heavy, limping, coming back through the trees. Bob tightened his grip on the rifle. His creature emerged from the forest. It was hurt. Bob could see that immediately, favoring its left side, moving slow. Blood dark against the dark fur matted its shoulder, but it was moving, still on its feet. Behind it, no sound. The larger creature wasn't following. Bob's creature made it halfway across the clearing before its legs gave out. It went down on one knee, caught itself with one hand, stayed there. Bob was moving before he knew he'd decided to move. Crossed the clearing at a run, Riley following. Reached the creature's side. "Let me see." The creature's head turned toward him. Its eyes were glazed with pain but still aware. It shifted slightly, letting Bob see the shoulder. The wound was deep. 4 parallel gashes, ragged at the edges. Whatever had made them had claws like knives and the strength to drive them deep. Blood welled up dark and steady. "Christ," Bob muttered. He'd field-dressed enough deer to know what serious bleeding looked like. This was serious. Not fatal, maybe not fatal, but it needed attention now, or it would be. The creature made a sound. Not pain, something else. Bob followed its gaze. At the tree line, the female and the juvenile stood watching. The juvenile tried to move forward. The female held it back, one massive hand on its shoulder. She was looking at Bob, measuring him, deciding something. Bob looked back at his creature. "Can you walk?" It tried to stand, made it to its feet, swayed, went down again. Okay. Bob's mind raced. The cabin was 20 yards away. The creature had to weigh 400 pounds, minimum, maybe 5. No way Bob could carry that, but he could help. He set the rifle down, moved to the creature's good side, got his shoulder under its arm. On 3, 1, 2, 3. They stood together. The creature leaned heavy on Bob, so heavy Bob's knees nearly buckled, but he locked them, took a step. The creature took one too, limping, leaving blood in the snow. Another step, another. The cabin felt a mile away. Riley ran ahead, kept looking back, whining. The female and juvenile followed at a distance. Bob could feel their eyes on him, could feel the weight of what he was doing. This wasn't leaving food on the porch. This wasn't an exchange of gifts. This was taking one of them inside, into his space, across a threshold that maybe shouldn't be crossed. But the blood was steady in the snow, and the creature's breathing was labored, and Bob thought about Ellen in the hospital, about how much he would have given for someone to help, when help mattered. They made it to the porch. Up the steps, each one an effort that made the creature grunt and Bob's back scream. Through the door. Inside, the cabin felt smaller with the creature in it. Smaller and stranger, like two worlds that weren't supposed to touch, had been forced together, and now neither one fit right. Bob guided the creature to the cot by the far wall. "Sit down. It's Saturday." The cot creaked, but held. The creature slumped against the wall, breathing hard, blood soaking into the blanket Bob had been sleeping under 4 hours ago. Bob's ranger training kicked in. First aid. He'd done this for hikers, for other rangers, for himself once when a widowmaker had caught him across the back. Bleeding first. Always stop the bleeding. He grabbed his kit from under the sink, opened it on the table. Gauze, tape, antiseptic. Needle and thread he'd used to sew up his own hand last year when the gutting knife slipped. The creature watched him. Pain in its eyes, but also something else. Trust maybe, or hope, or just exhaustion too deep to care anymore. "This is gonna hurt," Bob said. He poured antiseptic onto a rag, pressed it to the wound. The creature's whole body went rigid. Its hand shot out, grabbed Bob's wrist. The grip was careful, but Bob felt the strength in it. Understood that this thing could snap his arm like the pine sapling if it wanted to. It didn't want to. Bob waited. The creature's breathing steadied. Its grip loosened, released. "I know," Bob said quietly. "I know it hurts. But I got to clean it." He worked slow, cleaned the wound best he could, packed it with gauze, taped it down. The creature never made a sound. Just watched him work with those amber eyes that were so human in their pain, it made Bob's chest ache. When he was done, Bob sat back. His hands were shaking. Blood covered his sleeves. The cabin smelled like antiseptic and copper and the wild scent of the creature. Outside, a sound. Bob went to the window. The female and juvenile were on the porch now, pressed against the wall beside the door. Waiting. Bob opened the door. "It's okay," he said. "It's hurt, but it's okay." The female made a sound. Low, questioning. The juvenile tried to push past. She held it back, but her eyes were on the doorway, trying to see inside. Bob stepped aside. The female came through first, ducking to fit through the door, moving careful and controlled. The juvenile followed, pressing close to her side. They crossed to the cot. The female knelt, that same human gesture, so strange in a body that big, touched the injured creature's face. Made a sound that was unmistakably relief. The juvenile crawled onto the cot, nestled against the injured one's good side. The injured creature's arm came around it, protective even now. Bob stood by the table, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Riley had retreated to the corner, unsure. 3 massive creatures filled the cabin, made it feel like a dollhouse. And Bob didn't know what happened now. The female looked at him, stood, crossed to where he stood. Bob's heart hammered, but he held his ground. She reached out one hand, placed it over her chest, over her heart. Then, she reached out and placed it over Bob's. The gesture from before, but different now. Not greeting, not trade, something deeper. Bob felt his eyes sting, blinked hard. "You're welcome," he said. His voice came out rough. The female nodded. Then she moved to the door, looked back at the juvenile, made a soft sound. The juvenile whined, but didn't move from the cot. The injured creature's arm tightened around it. The female made the sound again. Firmer. The juvenile reluctantly climbed down, moved to her side. She touched its head, gentle, then guided it to the door. She looked back at Bob one more time. Her eyes held a question. Bob looked at the injured creature on his cot, looked at the blood soaking through the bandage, looked at the trust in those amber eyes. "It can stay," Bob said. "Long as it needs." The female nodded, touched her chest. Then she and the juvenile went out into the cold. Bob closed the door behind them, turned back to his cabin. The creature on his cot watched him. Outside, the sun was coming up, grey light filtering through the windows. Riley had crept closer, sniffing cautiously. Bob pulled up a chair, sat down. Exhaustion hit him like a wave. He'd been running on adrenaline, and now it was draining away, leaving him hollow. "Hell of a morning," he said. The creature made a sound. Might have been agreement. Bob looked at the window. Dawn was breaking over the pines, painting the snow gold. Somewhere out there, the larger creature was probably nursing its own wounds. Somewhere out there, the female and juvenile were waiting. And here, in a cabin in the UP, a 67-year-old man sat beside something that shouldn't exist and felt less alone than he had in 4 years. The world had gone strange, or maybe it had always been strange and Bob was just now learning to see it. He stood, made coffee, poured 2 mugs, handed one to the creature. It took it careful, drank slow. When it was done, it set the mug on the floor and closed its eyes. Bob sat in his chair and watched the sun rise, and Riley finally settled at his feet, and the cabin was warm, and outside the cold had teeth, but inside there was coffee, and quiet, and something that felt dangerously like purpose. For the first time since Ellen died, Bob thought maybe running out the clock wasn't the only option left. Maybe there were other ways to spend the time you had. Maybe you could still matter, even at the end. The creature's breathing evened out. Sleep, or as close as it could get to sleep with pain and blood loss. Bob pulled a blanket over it. The gesture felt absurd and necessary at the same time. He went to the window. The female and juvenile were visible at the tree line, dark shapes against white snow. Watching, waiting. Bob raised his hand. The female raised hers in return. Then Bob sat down at his table, Riley's head in his lap, and waited for whatever came next. Because something was coming. He could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. The larger creature was out there, hurt but not dead. And things that were hurt had a way of coming back meaner. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Bob had someone depending on him, something to protect, someone to help. For a man who'd spent 4 years being useless, that felt like everything. He drank his coffee, watched the light grow, and waited. The creature slept through the morning. Bob checked the bandage twice, changed it once when blood seeped through. Each time he touched the wound, the creature's eyes would crack open, watch him work, then close again. Trust was a strange thing. Bob had spent 40 years earning it from animals. Deer that would let him walk close, ravens that would take food from his hand. But this was different. This was consciousness, recognizing consciousness. This was choice. Around noon, the creature tried to sit up. Bob was at the stove, heating soup, the last of the venison stew he'd made days ago, back when the world was smaller and simpler. He heard the movement, turned. Easy. You lost a lot of blood. The creature's hand went to the bandage, touched it, careful, testing. Its face, because Bob had stopped being able to think of it as just a face. It had expressions, reactions. Personhood showed confusion, like it was trying to understand why a human would do this. Bob ladled soup into a bowl, brought it over. "You saved my life. Seems fair. I try to save yours." The creature took the bowl, held it in both hands, feeling the warmth, drank slow. When it was done, it made a sound, low, questioning. "The others, they're outside, waiting." Bob moved to the window, gestured. The creature shifted to see. At the tree line, the female and juvenile were visible. They hadn't left, had probably been there all night, keeping watch. The juvenile was moving in circles, restless. The female stood solid as stone. The creature made another sound, distressed. "They're okay," Bob said. "Cold, probably. Worried. But okay." The creature tried to stand, made it halfway before its legs buckled. Bob caught it, or tried to more like, provided something solid for it to lean against while it caught itself. The weight was tremendous. Bob's knees protested. "You need to rest." The creature shook its head. Human gesture, unmistakable meaning. It looked toward the door. Bob understood. Family was out there. Family was waiting. The creature wanted to go to them, wanted them to know it was alive. All right, but slow. They made it to the door together. Bob opened it. The cold rushed in, but behind it came something else. The female's head snapped up. She made a sound sharp, urgent, relieved, started toward the cabin. The juvenile was faster. It bounded across the clearing, through the snow, up the porch steps, crashed into the injured creature with enough force that Bob had to brace them both against the door frame. The injured creature's good arm came around the juvenile, held it close, made a sound Bob had never heard before. Something between a purr and a hum. Comfort, reassurance. The juvenile buried its face in the injured creature's chest. The female reached the porch, moved slower, more controlled, but her eyes held the same relief. She touched the injured creature's face, examined the bandage, looked at Bob. Bob met her gaze. "It needs rest. Probably a few days before it should be moving much." She couldn't understand his words, but she understood meaning. She looked back at the injured creature, then at the cabin interior, made a questioning sound. "You can all come in," Bob said. "It's gonna be tight, but you're welcome." The female hesitated. Bob saw the calculation in her eyes. Inside was warm, was safe, was where her injured family member was. But inside was also human space, was unknown, was crossing a line that maybe shouldn't be crossed. She made her decision, stepped through the door. The cabin shrank, 3 of them now. The injured one on the cot, the juvenile pressing close beside it, the female standing near the stove, her head nearly touching the rafters. Riley had retreated under the table, unsure but not growling, just watching with old, tired eyes that had seen stranger things than this in 13 years of life, but not by much. Bob closed the door. The wind had picked up outside. Weather coming in, he could feel it. The barometer on the wall was dropping. That slow slide that meant snow, meant a system moving through. "You picked a good time to come inside," he said, to himself, to them, to the air. "Storm's coming." The female looked at the window, at the grey sky pressing down. She knew storms, knew cold, but she also knew something else. Bob could see it in the tension in her shoulders, in the way her eyes kept going to the door. The larger creature was out there, wounded, angry, and storms made everything worse. Bob felt it too, that prickle at the base of his skull that said danger wasn't done with them yet. He'd felt it in the jungle 50 years ago, that sense of being hunted, had learned to trust it then, trusted it now. He checked the rifle. Full magazine. Chambered around, put the safety on. Leaned it by the door where he could reach it fast. The female watched him, understood what weapons were, what they meant. She moved to the window, looked out at the tree line. Bob joined her. "You feel it too." She made a sound, low, almost a growl. "Agreement. It'll come back," Bob said. not a question. The female's hand curled into a fist. She knew. The afternoon wore on. Bob made more soup, this time adding potatoes, onions, everything he had, fed it to all of them. The injured creature ate 2 bowls, color returning to its face. The juvenile ate 1, eyes darting around the cabin, curious about everything. The female ate standing, her attention divided between the food and the window. Outside, the first flakes began to fall. Bob had lived through enough UP winters to read snow. This wasn't the gentle kind, the kind that fell soft and made the world quiet. This was the mean kind, the kind that came sideways in the wind, that piled up in drifts taller than a man, that could kill you if you got caught out in it. By dusk, the world outside had disappeared behind a wall of white. The wind screamed around the cabin, found every crack and gap, made the walls creak and the windows rattle. The temperature was dropping. Bob could feel it even with the stove going full blast. He lit the kerosene lamps. The warm glow pushed back the darkness, made the cabin feel smaller but safer. The injured creature had fallen asleep again. The juvenile curled against it. The female sat near the door, her back to the wall, watching. Bob sat in his chair, Riley's head in his lap, listened to the storm and thought about Ellen. She would have loved this, would have found it miraculous. Proof of all the things she'd believed in that Bob had dismissed. Magic in the world, connection beyond language, the possibility that loneliness wasn't the only option. "I wish you could see this," he said quietly, to her ghost, to the empty space where she used to be. "I wish you could tell me what the hell I'm supposed to do now." The wind answered. Nothing else. Around midnight, Riley started growling. Bob's eyes snapped open. He hadn't realized he'd dozed off. The fire had burned low. The storm still raged outside. But Riley's growl cut through everything else low, continuous, the sound he made when something was very wrong. The female was on her feet. The injured creature was awake, sitting up despite the pain. Even the juvenile had gone still, pressed against its parent. Bob grabbed the rifle, moved to the window. Couldn't see anything through the snow but darkness and white. Then a sound. Under the wind, impact. Something hitting the side of the cabin. Hard. The female made a sound sharp, urgent. Warning. Another impact. The cabin shook. Bob's coffee mug fell off the table, shattered on the floor. "It's here," Bob said. Unnecessary. They all knew. The larger creature had come back. Impact again. This time against the door. The wood groaned. The latch rattled. Bob had locked it, but locks only worked if the door held. Another hit. The door frame cracked. The female moved fast. Positioned herself in front of the door, her body a barrier between the threat and her family. The injured creature tried to stand. The juvenile held it down. Bob chambered around. Get away from the door. The female didn't move. Impact. The door splintered. Not broken through, but close. Bob made a decision, moved to the door, stood beside the female. She looked at him. Bob looked back. "Together," he said. She understood. The next impact never came. Instead, a sound, scraping, moving around the cabin, going for the windows. Bob tracked it with the rifle. It's looking for a way in. The scraping stopped at the back window, the small one over the sink. Old glass, single pane, the weakest point, glass shattered. The female charged, across the cabin in 3 strides. A massive hand shot through the broken window grey fur, claws like knives, reaching, grasping. The female grabbed the arm, pulled. The larger creature roared, tried to yank its arm back. The female held on. The injured creature was up now despite everything, moving to help. Together they pulled. The larger creature's face appeared in the window. Those small, hate-filled eyes found Bob. Bob raised the rifle, sighted, finger on the trigger. The creature smiled, actually smiled. Like it knew guns, knew what they could do, knew Bob wouldn't shoot. Not while its arm was tangled with the female, not while the risk of hitting her was real. It was right. Bob lowered the rifle. The larger creature wrenched its arm free. disappeared from the window. Silence, except for the wind and heavy breathing inside the cabin. "It's playing with us," Bob said. The female made a sound. Agreement. Then Bob heard it. Under the wind. Above them. Oh hell. The roof. The larger creature had gone up. Was on the roof. Bob could hear it moving. Heavy footfalls on the shingles. Could hear wood creaking under the weight. The female looked up. The injured creature moved back to the cot, protecting the juvenile with its body. Riley was barking now. Sharp, panicked barks. Bob's mind raced. The roof was old. The rafters solid, but the shingles were compromised. He'd been meaning to replace them for 3 years, had never gotten around to it. 400 pounds of angry creature up there, and winter rot, and the ceiling cracked. Dust and wood chips rained down. A rafter groaned. The larger creature was directly above them now, above the center of the cabin, jumping, using its weight as a weapon. Another crack, wider this time. Bob could see darkness through the gap. "It's gonna come through," he said. The female knew. She moved under the crack, arms up, ready. The roof gave way. The larger creature dropped through in an explosion of wood and shingles and snow, hit the floor hard. The whole cabin shook. Riley yelped and fled to the corner. The larger creature rose to its full height. In the confined space of the cabin, it looked even bigger. It had to duck to fit under what was left of the rafters. Blood matted its side from the earlier fight, Bob realized. The injuries hadn't healed, had gotten worse maybe. Pain and infection, mixing with rage, to create something that couldn't be reasoned with. It looked at the injured creature on the cot, looked at the juvenile, looked at Bob. Then it charged. Not at the female, though she moved to intercept. Not at Bob, though he raised the rifle. At the cot, at the injured creature, and the juvenile. The female hit it mid-charge. They went down together, crashing into the table, smashing it to kindling. The injured creature shoved the juvenile behind it, stood despite the wound, despite the pain. The larger creature broke free from the female, backhanded her across the face. She went down. It turned to the injured creature. They faced each other. The injured one smaller, hurt, protecting. The larger one massive, enraged, beyond reason. Bob saw what was going to happen. The larger creature would kill the injured one, would kill the juvenile, would kill all of them, unless. Bob stepped between them, raised the rifle, pointed it at the larger creature's chest. "No." One word, said quiet. The larger creature stopped, looked at him. Those small eyes focused with an intelligence that was terrible because it understood exactly what it was doing, what it was choosing. "I know you're hurt," Bob said, his voice steady despite his heart trying to break through his ribs. "I know you're angry. I know the world's been cruel, but they didn't do it. They're not your enemy." The creature tilted its head, "And I'm not moving." Bob's finger tightened on the trigger. 40 years since Vietnam, 50 years since he'd pointed a rifle at something, and meant it. But he meant it now. The larger creature took a step forward. Bob fired. The shot was deafening in the confined space. The bullet took the creature in the shoulder. Not fatal, not even slowing it down much. But it was a message. The next one won't miss center mass. The creature stopped, looked at the wound, looked at Bob. Something moved behind those eyes. Calculation maybe. Understanding that Bob wasn't bluffing, wasn't hesitating, would absolutely pull the trigger again. It made a sound. Low, almost questioning. Bob chambered another round. "Leave. Now." For a moment, nothing happened. The wind howled through the broken roof. Snow fell on them all, covering the floor in white. The creature's breathing was loud, ragged. Then it moved, not forward, back. 1 step, 2. The female was on her feet now. She moved to Bob's side, added her presence to his. The injured creature did the same, limping, but standing, 3 of them in a line, family and stranger, protection and purpose. The larger creature looked at them, at all of them, then it turned, climbed back through the hole it had made, disappeared into the storm. Bob stood there, rifle still raised, for a full minute, making sure. Finally, he lowered it. The female touched his shoulder. Gentle. Bob looked at her. She touched her chest. His chest. Gratitude beyond language. Bob nodded. Couldn't speak. His hands were shaking. The injured creature sank back onto the cot. The juvenile pressed against it. Riley crept out from under the debris of the table, whining. Bob looked at the hole in his roof. Snow was coming in steady. The storm wasn't over, and now they were exposed. Well, he said, that's a problem. The female made a sound. She moved to the woodpile, selected several logs, began positioning them under the hole, bracing the damaged rafters. The injured creature, despite everything, got up to help. Together they shored up the roof enough that it wouldn't collapse further. Then the female went outside. Bob watched through the window. She returned with pine boughs, armfuls of them, passed them through the broken window to the injured creature, who positioned them over the hole. Not a perfect seal, but enough to block most of the snow and wind. Teamwork, problem-solving, intelligence. Bob helped where he could, which wasn't much. Mostly he stayed out of their way and tried to process what had just happened. He'd shot another living thing. First time in 50 years. The last time had been in the jungle, and he'd spent 3 months trying to forget the face of the boy soldier who'd gone down. Hadn't succeeded. Still saw that face sometimes. In dreams, in quiet moments. This was different. This was protection. This was choosing. But it still sat heavy in his chest, still made his hands shake even after the adrenaline faded. By 2 a.m., they'd done what they could. The cabin was colder with the broken window and compromised roof, but survivable. Bob fed the stove until it glowed red. Made coffee, because what else did you do after something like that? The female and injured creature sat together on the floor, the juvenile between them. Bob sat in his chair. Riley finally settled at his feet, still shaking. They stayed like that until dawn, not sleeping. Just existing in the space after violence, in the quiet that felt fragile because storms passed and morning came and what happened in the dark didn't stay there. As grey light filtered through the broken places, Bob looked at his hands, old hands, spotted and scarred and shaking. Hands that had built things and broken things and killed things and helped things. He didn't know what they'd done last night. Didn't know if shooting the creature had been right or wrong or just necessary. But he knew one thing. He'd chosen, after 4 years of letting life happen to him, of accepting loss like it was inevitable, of running out the clock he'd chosen. Chosen to stand between threat and family. Chosen to matter. Ellen would have been proud of that. Or maybe she would have said he was an idiot for not shooting to kill. He'd never know. The female stood, moved to the window. The storm had passed. The world outside was white and clean and still. She looked back at Bob, made a sound. Bob joined her at the window. Together they looked out at a forest transformed by snow and violence and choices made in the dark. It's not over, Bob said. The female touched her chest. His chest, shook her head. Bob understood. Not over, but not alone either. That would have to be enough. The days after had a dreamlike quality. Bob would wake in his chair, neck stiff from sleeping upright, and for a moment forget why. Then he'd see them 3 massive shapes in his cabin. The juvenile curled on the floor, the injured creature on the cot, the female always near the door, always watching. Then he'd remember. The storm, the fight, the choice. The hole in his roof let in light and cold in equal measure. Bob rigged a tarp over it, but it was temporary, would need real fixing, come spring, if he lived that long, if any of them did. The larger creature didn't come back. Not the next night, or the one after. But Bob felt it out there. The forest had changed. The silence had teeth now. Every sound made him reach for the rifle. Every shadow looked wrong. The female felt it too. She never relaxed. Even when the injured creature's wound began to heal clean edges, no infection, whatever biology they had worked different than human even then, she stayed tense, ready. On the third day, Bob went outside to split more wood. The injured creature followed him. Not to help. It was still weak, still favoring that shoulder. Just to be present. They stood in the clearing, breath steaming in the cold. The creature looked toward the tree line, made a sound, low, mournful. "Yeah," Bob said. "I know." The creature looked at him. Bob saw questions in those amber eyes. Why had Bob stood between it and the threat? Why had Bob shot his own kind's distant cousin? Why had Bob chosen them? Bob didn't have answers, didn't have words, even if he'd known the language. So he just stood there, an old man and an impossible thing, and let the silence hold what couldn't be spoken. That night, Bob made stew again. He was running low on supplies, hadn't been to town in 3 weeks, hadn't planned on going until spring, but he had enough. Enough for all of them. They ate together. The juvenile had lost some of its wariness, would come close to Bob now, curious. Once it touched his hand, careful, gentle, like it was learning what human skin felt like. Bob let it. After dinner, the female went to the broken window, stood looking out at the dark. Bob joined her. "You're worried about it coming back," he said. She made a sound. Affirmative. "Me too." They stood in silence. Then the female did something Bob didn't expect. She reached into the fur at her chest, pulled something out, extended it toward him. Another stone, but different from the first one. This was darker, shot through with veins of copper that caught the lamplight, warm in his palm when he took it. "Thank you," Bob said. The female touched her chest, then his. Then she pointed to the injured creature, to the juvenile, made a gesture that encompassed all of them. Bob understood. Family, not by blood, but by choice, by standing together when it mattered. His eyes stole. He blinked hard. "Yeah," he said, "family." That night, Bob slept deeper than he had in weeks. Dreamless sleep, the kind that healed. When he woke, gray light was filtering through the tarp over the roof. The fire had burned low. Riley was still asleep. The creatures were gone. Bob's heart dropped. He stood fast, looked around the cabin. The cot was empty. The juvenile's spot on the floor was vacant. The door stood slightly ajar. He grabbed his coat, his boots, stepped outside into the cold. They were in the clearing. All 3 of them. The female and injured creature stood facing the tree line. The juvenile was behind them, watchful, and at the tree line, barely visible in the pre-dawn gray, the larger creature stood. Bob's hand went to his hip. The rifle was inside. Stupid, careless. The female raised her hand, stopping him. "Wait." Bob waited. The larger creature didn't move, just stood there, at the edge of the trees. It looked different somehow. Smaller maybe, or just diminished. The wounds from their fight were visible even at this distance. Fresh ones and old ones. A body that had survived too much and was running on anger because everything else had been used up. The injured creature stepped forward, separated from the group, walked slow toward the larger one. Bob's chest tightened. "No," the female's hand on his shoulder. Firm. Trust. The injured creature reached the larger one. They stood maybe 10 feet apart. Steam rose from both of them in the cold. The injured creature made a sound. Not aggressive. Something else. The larger creature responded. Its voice different than before. Less rage. More pain. They were talking. Actually talking. A language Bob's ears couldn't parse, but his heart understood anyway. Hurt recognizing hurt. Anger meeting something that wasn't more anger. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then the injured creature did something that made Bob's throat close up. It extended its hand, palm out. The gesture Bob had learned meant connection, meant recognition. The larger creature looked at the hand, at the injured creature's face, at the cabin behind them, where Bob stood with the female. Then it turned and walked into the trees. Not running, not attacking, just leaving. The injured creature stood there for a long moment. Then it turned and walked back. The female met it halfway, touched its face, its wounded shoulder. relief in every line of her body. Bob found he was shaking. What the hell just happened? The injured creature looked at him, touched its chest, then pointed toward the trees where the larger creature had disappeared. Understanding came slow. The larger creature wasn't an enemy. It was something else. Sick, maybe. Lost. Driven by pain into behavior that wasn't natural, wasn't right. And the injured creature had recognized that, had offered something, understanding, forgiveness, the possibility of different. Whether the larger creature had accepted that possibility, Bob didn't know, but it had left without violence. That counted for something. They went back inside. Bob made coffee, fed the fire. The day stretched out ahead of them, ordinary and impossible in equal measure. Around noon, the injured creature stood, tested its shoulder, moved with more ease than it had since the fight. The wound was healing fast, faster than human, faster than should be possible. It looked at Bob, made a sound. Bob knew what that sound meant. Time. You're leaving. Not a question. The injured creature nodded. The female moved to stand beside it. The juvenile pressed against them both. Bob's chest felt hollow. When? The injured creature looked toward the window. The sun was at its peak, bright against the snow. Today. Now. Right. Bob's voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. You need anything? Food for the road? The female made a sound. Negative. They would be fine. Bob stood there, hands at his sides, feeling stupid and old, and like he should have words for this, but didn't. 4 years he'd been alone, had wanted to be alone, had built a life around being alone, and now these impossible things had shown up and broken through that wall, and he didn't know how to let them go, didn't know if he wanted to. The injured creature crossed to him, put one massive hand on Bob's shoulder, the weight of it familiar now, comforting. Bob put his hand over the creature's. You take care of that shoulder. Keep it clean. The creature nodded. And you, Bob, looked at the female. You keep them safe. She touched her chest. Promise. The juvenile came forward, shy now, like it understood this was goodbye. It touched Bob's hand, just for a second. Then pressed against its parents. They moved to the door. Bob followed. Riley whined but stayed inside, too old to understand what was happening but knowing it mattered. Outside, the day was clear and cold and beautiful in the way winter could be when it stopped trying to kill you. The sun caught the snow and threw diamonds everywhere. The trees stood black against white, patient and knowing. The three creatures walked to the edge of the clearing. The juvenile kept looking back. The injured creature walked steady, healed enough to travel. The female led them toward the tree line. At the edge, they stopped, turned back. All three placed their hands over their chests, then extended them toward Bob. Bob raised his hand, placed it over his heart, held it there. They stood like that for a moment. A man and three creatures that shouldn't exist. Family by choice, connected by violence and kindness, and the strange alchemy that turned strangers into something more. Then they walked into the trees. Bob stood in the clearing until he couldn't see them anymore. Until the forest had swallowed them whole. Until the only sound was wind and his own breathing and the particular silence that comes after something important ends. He went back inside. The cabin felt bigger now, emptier, but different than it had felt empty before. This was the empty after fullness, after presence, after mattering. Riley looked up at him, confused. They're gone, boy. Bob sat in his chair, looked at the broken table, the hole in the roof, the blood still staining the floorboards. Evidence. Proof. He'd fix some of it, leave some of it. Reminders. He pulled the 2 stones from his pocket. The first one and the new one, held them both, felt their weight. The phone rang. Bob stared at it. The phone hadn't rung in 6 months. He'd kept the line because Ellen had always insisted, what if there's an emergency? What if someone needs you but nobody ever called? It rang again. Bob stood, crossed to it, picked up the receiver. Yeah? Dad? His daughter's voice. Melissa. He hadn't heard it in 3 years. Not since the funeral, Not since the fight about him staying up here instead of moving closer. Not since he'd told her he was fine, and she'd told him he was being stubborn, and they'd both said things that couldn't be unsaid. Melissa. She stopped, started again. I had this dream about you, about something in the woods, and I needed to call. Are you okay? Bob looked at the cabin, at the evidence of the last week written in broken wood and blood, and the shape of things that had been here and weren't anymore. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'm okay. You sound different. Maybe I am. Silence on the line. Then, I was thinking about coming up. If you'd want that. Bob looked at the 2 stones in his hand. Thought about standing between threat and family. Thought about choosing. Thought about how you could be 67 and tired and running out of clock and still find reasons to matter. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that a lot. They talked for 20 minutes. Small things mostly. Her job, her kids, his grandkids who he'd only met once. Plans for her to visit in spring. The conversation awkward but real, like muscles remembering how to move after being still too long. When he hung up, Bob stood looking at the phone for a long time. Then he went to the window, looked out at the tree line. No movement, no shapes, just forest and snow and the cold sunlight falling through the pines. But he could feel them out there, not watching exactly, just present, part of the landscape now, part of his world. He put the stones on the windowsill next to the first one. 3 now. 3 reminders that the impossible was real and kindness echoed, and being alone was a choice you could unmake. That night, Bob sat on the porch, despite the cold, coffee in hand, blanket across his lap, Riley at his feet. The stars came out hard and bright. No moon, just starlight, and the white snow throwing back what little light there was. Around midnight, he heard it. 3 knocks, not on the cabin, somewhere in the trees. Distant but clear. Bob smiled, raised his coffee cup toward the sound. 3 knocks came back. Then silence. He sat there until the cold drove him inside. Tomorrow he'd start fixing the roof. Call Melissa back. Maybe drive into town for supplies, though the roads would be hell. Tomorrow he'd live. Tonight he just sat with his dog and his coffee, and the knowledge that the world was bigger than they told you it was, stranger and kinder, and more full of possibility than any book or map or reasonable person would admit. The measure of a soul, Ellen used to say, is how it answers the knock. He'd answered, and in answering, he'd found something he thought he'd lost 4 years ago in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and defeat. Not happiness, not peace, not any of the things people said you were supposed to find. Just this, the quiet certainty that he still had something to give. That being needed mattered. That family was whoever stood with you when it counted. The cold had teeth. The dark had eyes. The forest held secrets. And Bob Macklin, 67 years old with a bum ticker and a dead wife and a daughter he hadn't talked to in 3 years, was part of those secrets now. The woods didn't answer when you called to them, but they listened. And sometimes, rarely, when you stood in the right place at the right time with the right kind of openness in your heart, they gave you exactly what you needed, even if you never knew you needed it. Bob finished his coffee, went inside, locked the door, built up the fire, and slept, and dreamed of amber eyes and gentle hands, and the particular sound gratitude makes when it doesn't need words. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the quiet weight of it, drop a comment. Let me know what part stayed with you. More stories like this coming.